Hey, friends. Many apologies about the long break. I will say a few words at the end about why I ended up being off air for so long. But meanwhile, I wanted to get right into the meat of the episode. Actually, wait, there is one thing I wanted to say first. Happy birthday, Drea. All right, having done that, let's talk Zohran Mamdani. Not long after the last episode we did before the break, Zohran pulled off a landslide win in the New York City mayoral election. We actually recorded a live GTA episode that night in New York with Anders Lee and Naomi Caravani and R.M. Brown at a bar in Queens that's part owned by our friend TJ. I'm not sure what happened to the recording. Honestly, I've been pretty preoccupied lately, so I haven't tracked down who has it, but I will post it here if I can get a hold of it. The podcast was in the performance area in the basement. It was a great show. We definitely filled the room. The panel was great, like I knew it would be with that combination of people. And we managed to wrap up the episode just as the results were starting to come in. So we could transition straight to the celebration party. They had a, like DJ. We didn't have anything to do with setting that up, but TJ did, and good time was had by all, and turned down the volume so everybody could watch Zohran's victory speech, and the bar gave everybody like a glass of champagne after that. Very politically friendly environment, and I have to say the whole thing felt like, well, let's put it like this. I can date the exact moment of the last time before Zohran's win when I actually felt happy and excited and optimistic about American electoral politics. That would be February 22nd, 2020, the day that Bernie Sanders won the Nevada caucus. I flowed in a couple days before and spent the day before the caucus canvassing cab drivers on the Vegas Strip for Bernie. And when it was obvious that we'd won, it really felt like we were on the cusp of something amazing. Bernie had pulled off a hat trick. He'd won all three of the first three primaries and caucuses. And as hard as this can be to remember 5 years later, at the time, the whole mainstream media political discourse was about what would happen or should happen if Bernie showed up at the convention with only a plurality of the delegates, not an absolute majority, and what could be done to block him from getting the nomination, and whether it would be legitimate to do anything to block him from getting the nomination, and all of that. Now, obviously, we all know how the story ends in South Carolina and after, and honestly, it's hard for me to emotionally disentangle all of the horrible things that happened in the next few months. The pandemic started and the world shutting down and Michael Brooks dying. It's all kind of one big knot of horribleness. But a big part of that knot is the sense that the best hope for democratic socialism in my lifetime was going up in flames. The years since then have been a catastrophe. Good point, Red. The years since then have been a catastrophe for the American left to a point that's hard to overstate. All of our worst pre-Bernie habits, all of our dumbest pre-Bernie pathologies came crashing back that summer in 2020. All the identity politics and purity test witch hunting and just 100 different kinds of counterproductive bullshit. I spent the early months of the pandemic finishing writing a book called Canceling Comedians While the World Burns, a critique of the contemporary left, which was all about what I called there the left's pathologies of powerlessness. Put a pin in that. We'll get back to it. The last part of the book I wrote was an appendix on New York DSA canceling the talk by Adolph Reed, which dates when I was finishing up. That was, right at the beginning of, George Floyd's summer. And I can remember that I was collecting the back cover blurbs in late June and early July. The one from Michael Brooks came in just before the 4th of July, 2020. I remember texting with him about it while I was on my way to drive over and meet a friend in Lansing to have a socially distanced beer and watch the fireworks in his backyard, right? That was actually just a couple of weeks before Michael died. Within 5 months after that, we were deep in the force the vote controversy, which, if you don't remember it, actually, if you don't remember it, I'm tempted to just say stop watching the stream because you're so much better off that you don't know what this is. But if you don't remember it, this was a campaign to denounce and disavow the tiny handful of democratic socialists who'd been elected to Congress for the crime of not trying a particular parliamentary maneuver that no one would have even noticed realistically if they had done it. The idea was that they would bargain with Nancy Pelosi, making their votes to re-up her as speaker, conditional on her agreeing to hold a floor vote on Medicare for all. Realistically, if they'd done that and they'd gotten their vote, the only people who would have even known it was happening would be C-SPAN junkies. And even they would have forgotten it a week later, since it would have been defeated 2-1 with zero drama, right? Since half of the Democrats in Congress and every single Republican were openly and unabashedly opposed to Medicare for all. It wasn't a secret where anybody stood. I remember at the time, Brianna Joy Gray wrote an article for Current Affairs where she said, well, you know, it would get a lot of attention if the unions got involved and combined it with a general strike, which I remember hearing that and thinking, wait, what? This is a country with what, like 6.2% private sector unionization? And she wrote this article in December 2020. The theoretical, floor vote was supposed to happen in January 2021. So she thought that in a country with 6.2% private sector unionization, we're somehow going to get together the first nationwide general strike in American history in a few weeks after she said that, so people would pay more attention to a no suspense floor vote. What? No one was confused about which congressmen were for or against Medicare for all by the end of 2020. It's not just that there was no scenario in which that vote would have passed and we would have gotten Medicare for all. There isn't even any scenario where it would have led to anyone being primaried for voting no. The issue had dominated debates in the Democratic Party since the beginning of the 2020 primaries. Half the Democrats in Congress had signed on as Medicare for all co-sponsors, and no one was confused about which Democrats were in that half and which were in the other half who were against it. No new information would have been revealed by the vote if it had happened. It would have just been a symbolic landslide defeat for Medicare for all that would have made the idea seem more out of reach than ever. But as little sense as the whole thing made, if you actually stop to think about it, the effect of Force the Vote was to train a whole micro-generation of internet leftists to think AOC and the rest of the squad were horrible sellouts. And we're seeing the fruits of that now with all the idiots you see on Twitter saying things like, oh, I was hoping Zohran would be better, but I'm worried that he's becoming the new AOC. And when people say that, right, like that only makes sense because in the version of reality that people like this live in, it just goes without saying. It's just a universally accepted axiom that AOC is a horrible sellout. And the moment that narrative really started to metastasize is with Force the Vote. Because even though none of it really made any sense, if you started thinking about the details, on a vibes level, the message was, oh, she's selling out Medicare for all. And it's been fucking amazing, by the way, in the years since then, to start to see some of the people who pushed that narrative hardest, people like Jimmy Dore, lining up behind open enemies of Medicare for all in some cases. Like AOC is a sellout because she didn't try one particular parliamentary maneuver that wouldn't have done anything anyway. But RFK Jr. is based because, he's the enemy of the pharmaceutical industry. Never mind that he's never once pretended to support Medicare for all. And in fact, he's quite openly against it. And look, I don't think AOC is a perfect politician by any means. I've got my criticisms. She's cast some votes I disagree with, and I've certainly had issues with her, rhetorical strategy in some ways, the way she's sometimes leaned into identity politics and tried to combine it with a Bernie economic platform. I think that's a counterproductive combination. The left is way more effective when we put a lot of that stuff aside, not throwing anybody under the bus on policy, but making big, broad, unifying, universalist appeals. I actually have an article that I think is coming out today in Jacobin making the case that if AOC runs for president, it's going to be important that she move away from the identity stuff and run with the kind of universalist class first messaging that, to be fair, she did spend a lot of this year promoting at those fighting oligarchy rallies with Bernie. So my point is that yay, AOC, she's perfect. But I think that it was incredibly toxic. It was profoundly counterproductive. That started within months of Bernie's defeat in 2020. You had big, significant chunks of left media and the online left that had switched from being part of Bernie's digital army in the 2020 primaries to seeing their role as being to tear down the few democratic socialists who'd achieved any kind of prominence in the United States. That just seemed totally crazy to me. Like, sure, we should criticize those politicians when they do need to be criticized. I definitely don't think they're above disagreement and criticism. But if the goal is to move American society to the left, we should be doing what we can to support and back up the faction of organized American politics that we agree with the most. That seems so basic and obvious that it actually feels weird to have to say it out loud. But what I've really seen in the 5.5 years since Bernie lost is that more and more the online left and left media spaces have been taken over by contrarianism and pointless performative ultra-leftism and the hot take economy. And it's hard to even put into words how much I hate it all. If you care about the things the left is supposed to stand for, from Medicare for all, to rebuilding the labor movement, to ending the wars, to freeing Palestine, achieving some kind of basic social democracy in the short term and actual socialism in the long-term horizon, right? A world of collective ownership and workplace democracy. There's just no universe where any of this shit that the online left has been soaking in for the last 5.5 years contributes to moving the needle in the right direction. There's no universe where it does anything but divide and demoralize and burn out what few ground troops the left has managed to build up so far. All of which goes to why I've been so damn excited by this Zohran win. I remember sitting with Jason Miles at a coffee shop in Baja before the Democratic primary in New York, over the summer. And he said something about Zohran, and I said, yeah, it's going to be so heartbreaking when he comes within a hair and then loses to Cuomo. And Jason said, oh, is there polling to show that? And I said, no. That's just my general sense of how reality works, right? That good things never happen for us. So I was just blown away when he did win and won big on primary night. Not only won big, but did it by doing what Bernie was never really able to do, which is to expand the primary electorate by bringing in a shit ton of new voters. And then seeing how he built on that, how he brought in even more new voters to his coalition between then and the election was incredible. At that after party after the GTA live show in Queens on election night, seeing Zohran, on the screen, talk about Eugene V. Debs and democratic socialism in his victory speech was genuinely amazing. And what makes this guy such a unicorn is that two things are true of him that aren't really true of any of the other post-Bernie Berniecrats. First, he has Obama levels of natural talent as a politician, obviously. But second, and this is an amazing combination with the first one, this is like two lightning strikes hitting the same spot at the same time. He's actually personally a product of the post-Bernie millennial left. I mean, the man was a Jacobin contributor several times before he ran for mayor. Other Berniecrats might have joined DSA as a gesture while they were running for office, but their politics weren't formed by DSA. There were just progressive Democrats who liked what Bernie was saying and moved to the left in a more socialistic direction in the Bernie and post-Bernie moment. But that wasn't really where they started. Like, I've been reading Ryan Grimm's book, The Squad, and as he points out there, AOC interned for Ted Kennedy for a while back in like 2011. And I don't bring that up to shit on AOC. Things were bleak in 2011, right? There was just no meaningful left presence in real American politics. And at least Ted Kennedy was talking about universal health care. So I could actually see why somebody with AOC's inclination would would gravitate to him back then. But that's just a very different thing from someone like Zohran, who was actually a cadre DSA member for years before the first time he ran for anything. Was deeply involved in DSA enough to know like what the factions and caucuses were and have opinions about him. There's an old clip of him from a YDSA event years ago that the right tried to make hay of during the election, where he talks about seizing the means of production, which, is hilarious because, I guess the premise is, oh my God, he wants to seize the means of production. So that's, if he becomes mayor of New York, the world's going to end. Because up until about 15 minutes ago in the big historical picture, the British Labour Party, for example, like various social democratic and labor parties all around the world, advocated the same thing, right, as their long-term horizon. Clause 4 of the Labour Party Constitution committed the party to public ownership of the means of production until Tony Blair finally got it changed in the 1990s, right? Like I was a teenager, I guess, right, when that was changed. So God knows there are plenty of Labour Party mayors of cities like London and Manchester at that time, and the world didn't end. So, maybe everybody could calm down about that. But, the world didn't end, but all those Labour mayors did a lot of things like build large-scale council housing estates, bring utilities and transport under municipal ownership, expand public health and sanitation services, create public parks, and use wage policy and social programs to raise working-class living standards. Just like maybe Zohran can push through some reforms that can make New York City a bit more livable for the working class, which would be absolutely amazing as proof of concept for the left and help spread his example to other cities. And God knows, maybe get us to a point where those national horizons that came crashing down 5.5 years ago when Bernie lost might actually open up again. That would be fucking nice. In fact, I would argue that nothing is more important than that right now. It's literally the single most important thing the left can help bring to fruition in the next year or two, because if Zohran could have an even halfway successful mayoralty with some real, serious, tangible material accomplishments, that could be a national level game changer for the socialist left. If you don't see how huge that would be, I really don't see much hope for you. Honestly, you might as well stop watching or stop listening if you're listening to this later in the podcast feed. But if you do get that basic premise about how huge a successful Zohran mayoralty would be, how good that would be for changing the whole terrain everything else is playing out on nationally, and you want to go from there and see what follows, then yeah, do keep watching. Because a lot of the criticisms that I've been seeing of Zohran, both from online randos and in some cases from some pretty prominent people in left media, seem totally bizarre to me in light of that basic premise. Like, let's go through a few of those criticisms one at a time. And I'm sure there'll be people in the comments in this episode saying, oh, Ben is saying we can't criticize Zohran. He's saying Zohran should be above criticism. And no, I am fucking not. I'm saying that the criticisms I've been seeing don't make sense to me. And I think they come from a really deeply flawed place in terms of how the left is understanding itself and its role. So let's talk about that. Here are some of the big ones I've seen, right? He won't back a primary challenge against Hakeem Jeffries. He won't fire Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch. He won't defund the police. He met with Donald Trump, which makes him a fascist collaborator. He's too much of a YIMBY about real estate, and some of his transition team appointments reflect that. He's too soft on Palestine. He must be moving away from his good positions on Palestine, because he said in an interview that he discouraged the use of the phrase globalize the intifada. And in his statement on the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, he said that killing civilians is bad, whether the civilians are Palestinian or Israeli. He says that he'll have people in his administration who disagree with him about Zionism, which means that he isn't a real anti-Zionist, because a real anti-Zionist would commit to hiring 0 Zionists anywhere in the city government, even for sanitation jobs, like the de-Baathification of Iraq. And None of these make a lot of sense to me, but let's start right at the beginning of the list, because this, right, that he won't primary Jeffries. He won't back a primary challenge against Jeffries. And, he argued within DSA against doing so, is probably the biggest one. The one that even some people I agree with about a lot of these other subjects disagree with me about. So Crystal Ball, for example, who I usually agree with about like 99% of everything in terms of day-to-day politics, she even had the same basic take on the Trump meeting that I did, but she disagrees with me about this one. So let's take a look at what she said.
Behind him, that's it. Let's move on. I understand why. I understand the logic. I think it is a similar logic as the one that leads him to, go to the White House and strike up a friendly relationship with Trump, which is that he feels that the end of the day, he wants to do whatever he can and be as pragmatic as possible in achieving his agenda. On this decision, though, I don't think that the calculation really works out because Jeffries is not the president of the United States. He does not have that level of power in New York City. He cannot thwart your ambitions to that degree.
That's definitely the smartest, most careful way of seeing somebody present that case. But I have to say her distinction at the end there doesn't quite add up to me. Because sure, Jeffries isn't the president, but there's a real good chance that he'll be running the House of Representatives a little over a year into Zohran's term. If that happens, the Speaker of the House isn't the president, but Speaker of the House also isn't exactly chopped liver in terms of New York City's relationship with the federal government. Look, to me, this is a real simple question. Let's pretend that Chiose, who's the guy who's going to primary Jeffries, would have won. From everything I've heard from people who know more than I do about the district, it's overwhelmingly likely that he would have lost. And so if Zohran and the DSA had backed his play, the only effect of the whole thing would be that if Dems win the midterms and Jeffries becomes speaker, you'd have a pissed off speaker looking for payback. But hey, maybe I'm wrong about that. And, maybe there's a good enough chance I'm wrong about that the risk would have been worth it. Maybe Ossie would have won. Let's just accept that he would have won for the sake of argument. Here's the question. Which is the bigger prize? Expanding the squad by one new member who would have had no more power than any other congressman, or having some leverage over the new Speaker of the House after the midterms because that guy's district is in New York City and he has to look over his shoulder to make sure you don't primary him in the future. People sometimes talk about this as if they think that Jeffries losing the primary means that whoever beat him would become the Speaker of the House if there's a Dem majority, right? They'll talk about all the reasons Jeffries shouldn't be Speaker of the House as if those were reasons to primary him. Or at least as if they think that Jeffries losing would mean that the Dems would then pick a better speaker who is to Jeffries' left and who wasn't as bad on Palestine as Jeffries and who was more willing to stand up to Trump than Jeffries. But there's no reason to think any of that. Centrist Democrats aren't going to pick an anti-Zionist leftist Speaker of the House because the centrist speaker they voted for last time lost his primary. They just pick some other centrist who'd be every bit as shitty as Jeffries and every bit as pro-Israel as Jeffries, but whose district would not be located in New York City where Zohran's army is. And so that guy wouldn't be anything like as vulnerable to bullying from the left as a Speaker Jeffries would be. That's such an obvious tactical calculation to me that I cannot wrap my head around how so many of my friends and comrades aren't seeing it. Honestly, it's about enough to make me think I'm just missing something, but I really don't think I am. Honestly, what I think is going on here, and I'm not, talking about everybody, right? I don't want to paint with too broad a brush there. But I think, a big part of what's going on here does actually go back to the central thesis of canceling comedians while the world burns, right? About the left's pathologies of powerlessness. For most of my life, socialism was almost as fringe on the left as outright monarchism was on the right. In 2025, if I meet someone at a bar and they say they're a DSA member, I say, oh, cool, me too. And then we both forget about it 5 minutes later. But in 1998, the year I graduated from high school, or 2008, or 2015, before Bernie started running for president, if I ran into somebody at a bar and found out that by some insane cosmic coincidence, they were a member of the same socialist organization that I was, that would be a pretty big night for both of us. Socialism was way the hell out in the political wilderness. I can remember the early 2000s, before YouTube started up, before anyone knew what a podcast was. I think the first one was like 2003 or something. When I'd get excited and go to Barnes & Noble whenever one of these new Chomsky books came out that were just anthologies of transcripts of people interviewing him. Because reading those little interview transcript books, like I remember like a little one that was just called 9/11, was practically the only way you get access to any kind of radical left perspective, short of finding a radical leftist group and going to the meeting, or ordering some literature directly from some little Trotskyist or Maoist micro-organization. And I love those Chomsky books, but there was never a point in one of them where he said, like, if the socialist left takes power in the United States, here's exactly how we should run our foreign policy and sort of how we should approach the same kind of issue I'm talking about if it comes up. Because in like 2002, 2003, that would have sounded like saying, well, when I become emperor of the galaxy, I'm going to whatever, right? Start with the McCarthy period, where organized radical dissent in the United States, the big socialist and communist movements you had in the 30s and 40s when those big labor struggles were going on, whatever was left of all that was pretty much crushed in the McCarthy period. And even when radicalism revived again in the New Left era, it was revived in a really deeply flawed form that wasn't rooted in the organized working class at all, and often didn't even like aspire to link up with the working class. And then even that version of the left had really petered out, and, petered out on its own, been destroyed by COINTELPRO, et cetera, right? There's a whole toxic mixture of things that had happened, but it had really imploded by the end of the 1970s. And, going into the 80s, like what was left of all that had really collapsed into single issue advocacy groups waging their lonely little, political protest forever wars for their disparate causes, and an alphabet soup of little sectarian micro-organizations that all thought they were the nucleus of a future vanguard party. That's the world I came into when I became a socialist as a teenager. It was fucking bleak. And what I argue in Canceling Comedians is that in that landscape, even the people who did hold on to the socialist faith didn't really believe they were going to win. Not really. Even if they said they thought they would, deep down, they kind of took it for granted that they were going to lose. And it went without saying they were going to lose. But at least they'd lose honorably. They'd go down swinging, fighting the good fight, which is a phrase I really hate, by the way, fighting the good fight, as if fighting were a goal in itself, separate from actually winning and improving material conditions in the real world. There's a great old Michael Albert video you can find on YouTube where Albert is making fun of that phrase. Like, if we're just fighting the good fight, why not do something else with your life? Go to the beach, try to enjoy the time you've got. If I'm going to spend my life fighting, it's because I think I might actually accomplish something. And when your conception of the purpose of radical politics ends up getting whittled down to just taking a stand, fighting the good fight, making a symbolic moral protest against the many very real and, absolutely maddening injustices of the world around you, it becomes natural that you gravitate toward whatever you think the most extreme stand you can take might be, because that shows that it's a really pure stand that, makes you feel good because you feel very separate from the fallen world around you. And it becomes natural, if all you're doing is a symbolic moral protest anyway, to spend a lot of time policing whether other people are really taking as true a stand as yours, or whether maybe they're stealing your fighting the good fight valor. Instead of trying to expand the tent and pitch your socialist politics in a way that might appeal to all those millions and millions of not terribly political semi-lib normies, semi-lib at best, maybe more like semi-conservative. You spend your time, instead of doing that, trying to police the boundaries of Radical Politics Club to make sure that everybody is taking the right stand with you. And to a great extent, I'm talking about the dynamics of, a sort of small far left subculture here. But, you saw this playing out on a much larger scale, for example, back in the summer of 2020. I remember David Griscom telling me, he was still living in Brooklyn at the time, that the Facebook page of his local beer garden was being overrun with people who were furious at them for not issuing a Black Lives Matter statement. Never mind that they hadn't posted anything about anything since the pandemic started. I remember there was a story about a theater director I read who had created a Google Doc. There was like an open access Google Doc that so anybody could add names to it of local theater directors who hadn't issued a statement of support for Black Lives Matter in the protest. So literally an open source denunciation list. What could go wrong? And I remember hearing about that at the time and thinking, why on earth would anyone give a shit what a local theater director said about any of this? Can you imagine like a local mayor or police chief who was opposed to whatever reforms people were demanding of the local police department, seeing the theater director's statement of support for Black Lives Matter just coming around because the police chief is such a live theater super fan that if the theater says it, okay, I guess that's good enough for me. I have to say my imagination really isn't that good. But again, if you don't really have a theory of change, if you don't really believe you're going to win, if it's all just symbolic protest, fighting the good fight, those assumptions about priorities and effectiveness just sort of doesn't come up in the first place. When I wrote Canceling Comedians, my take was that these pathologies of powerlessness were bad habits left over from the left's sojourn in the political wilderness that were getting in our way now that the door of political possibility was starting to open up for us a bit, which I thought it obviously was. Because, hey, look at Bernie, look at Corbyn in the UK. Anybody remember Jeremy Corbyn? I wonder what he's up to. Something useful and constructive, I'm sure. But what happened in 2020 was that it felt like that door of political possibility was slamming shut in our faces. And all the old bad habits got worse than ever for a while. And even though, thank God, we've moved on from like peak woke of 2020, there are versions of the same basic pathologies that are stronger than ever now. And I think it's important to recognize the dynamics that feed into that. For the micro generation of the socialist left that was radicalized by the Bernie campaign, and maybe started reading Jacobin or listening to Chapo Trap House because they were excited about the Bernie moment, the big sort of immediate term political issue they were excited about was Medicare for all. Whereas for the micro generation of the socialist left, the micro generations of the socialist left that have come up since then, it's been either, police violence after the murder of George Floyd or Palestine after October 7th, 2023, and the beginning of the Israeli genocide in Gaza. And obviously, those are both important causes. Policing in the United States is often racist and abusive. Our prison system is a human rights abomination. Everybody should check out Matthew Whalen's new book about Alabama prisons, for example. And we absolutely do need to find ways to arrive at a more humane and reasonable criminal justice system. And no one needs to convince me, obviously, that Gaza is the biggest moral outrage, in important respects of my lifetime. The live stream genocide. And I'm going to be furious about the way mainstream American media, mainstream America, right, sort of stood by and let it happen until the day I die. I spent a lot of 2023 and 2024 and 2025 writing article after article after article for Jacobin, and sometimes I get them in more mainstream venues, Daily Beast, MSNBC, whatever, doing my bit to try to take apart apologetics for the horrors in Gaza. I did a teach-in at the Palestine encampment at Princeton, right? Before 2023, right? This has been an important issue for me as long as I've been arguing about politics, and it always will be. I think some of the first political arguments I ever remember getting into in my life were about Israel-Palestine. It would have been shameful if the left hadn't done, whatever was in our limited power to speak out against the genocide. But here's the problem. if you were radicalized under circumstances where the main issue people were thinking about was Medicare for all, that was something that would actually personally benefit you. And so that meant you were a lot more likely to be willing to be smart and strategic about how you pursued it, because you had skin in the game. You had something to gain, right, from being smart and strategic. Whereas police violence was always framed in those 2020 protests primarily as a racial issue, which honestly I think was a huge mistake. We always should have been emphasizing that militarized policing can impact anyone of any race who lives in poor neighborhoods, but whatever, that's a separate issue, separate discussion. It was primarily framed at the time as a racial justice issue, and most leftists are white, which meant that they were taught that their role was to be so-called allies, right? Fighting on behalf of other people, in other words. And it's just a fact of geography that Gaza was an issue where people were protesting on behalf of distant others. And again, my point isn't that we should be like deranged super Nietzscheans who only care about ourselves and don't fight for other people. I absolutely think we should fight for other people. And I also don't need to be convinced that freeing Palestine would be an indirect benefit to the workers' movement in the West for all sorts of reasons, that free up money for domestic social priorities, that, a lot of sort of, surveillance that's, then used in the West is, engineered there, all that, right? I know all that. I don't need to be convinced of any of that. But none of that has anything to do with my point. The simple point I'm just making here is that when you're radicalized primarily around issues that center on injustices being done to other people, not you, but other people somewhere else, that inculcates a really unhelpful way of thinking about radical politics, because you're less likely to think about how to be smart and strategic in pursuing your political goals. In fact, making strategic choices under those circumstances often feels like a betrayal of those distant others that you're fighting for. Instead, you prove how committed you are to them by being really unbending and going down fighting the good fight. And I think that helps reinforce this mindset where people talk like it's a point of socialist principle, that you don't pick your battles. You just fight every battle all the time, no matter what. Like it's a betrayal of the cause if Zohran doesn't pick every fight on every issue, back every primary challenger if the person being primaried is bad enough, no matter what the strategic calculations are. Fire every bad official, no matter what what the politics of the political fight that's going to start are going to be, and no matter how it's going to go for you, and no matter what that's going to do to the rest of your agenda. And on that note, let's talk about Jessica Tisch. Right? She sucks. She's awful. And it would be the least surprising thing ever if, she came into conflict with the new mayor at some point over the next couple of years, and she didn't make it to the end of his term without either resigning or being fired. My guess is at some point that'll happen. But I cannot for the life of me understand the idea that Zohran has an obligation to pick a huge messy fight over police issues right out of the gate that's going to derail his agenda and change the subject from the place that he's been doing everything in his power to keep the subject for the last year, which is on economics and affordability and childcare and making the city more livable for the working class, and switch to fighting on ground that's going to be politically awful for him, that's going to revive all the old, he's a crazy person who wants to defund the police and he doesn't care about, protecting you from violent criminal smears that his enemies have spent the last year trying to get everybody to talk about. Back in 2020, when all the energy and all the focus, all the momentum was on policing issues, basically nothing happened, right? I mean, some things happened, but by and large, the NYPD pretty much kept doing its thing. But you think that if Zohran grinds everything to a halt to get into a giant, messy, politically damaging fight over police stuff in 2025, after 5 years of public backlash and anything that smells like defund being about as popular as intestinal cancer among persuadable working class normies, you think now under these circumstances he's going to win that fight? Do you really think that? Or do you really want him to go down swinging, fighting the good fight because you think it's honorable? For some people, the issue about Tisch seems to be less even about day-to-day criminal justice issues and more about her being a big old Zionist who's thrown the book at pro-Palestine protesters when she gets the chance, which is all true. Tisch sucks. But then the argument that this is a fight you should pick starts to get confusing again, because is the idea that Zohran is going to find an anti-Zionist police commissioner to replace her with? I saw a clip on social media from Brianna Joy Gray's podcast where either Brianna or one of her guests, I don't remember, was arguing with Ross Barkan about this. And if I'm remembering this right, Barkan says, well, guys, there aren't really a lot of anti-Zionists on the bureaucratic bench there, right, to replace Tisch. And, Brianna or her guest said, okay, whoever replaces Tisch will also be a Zionist, sure, but does it have to be the worst one? Which is the kind of superficially clever and fun line that gets people to snap along, but stops making sense if you put literally 5 or 10 seconds of thought into it. You want Zohran to derail his affordability agenda by picking a massive, messy, politically damaging fight for the sake of replacing a police commissioner who's a Zionist with a new police commissioner who's like also a Zionist, but not quite as bad. That's the great prize that it would all be worth it to achieve, like a slightly less bad Zionist police commissioner, really? But if we're talking not about Zionism, but about day-to-day police issues, let's talk about that too, because it takes us to another big Zohran criticism, which you see it in some places. I think Lily Sanchez, I believe, wrote an article for Current Affairs criticizing Zohran about this during the general election. And lots of other people have brought up similar points, which is that he doesn't want to defund the police. And I realize that this is the place I might lose some people because honestly, as much as American police is often far too militarized, as much as it can be racist and abusive and needs to be reformed in many different ways, I also think that public safety is a social democratic good, like healthcare and housing. And I think sometimes the left doesn't take working class people's concerns about street crime nearly seriously enough. Look at any poll. Working class people of all races worry a lot about street crime. I just don't think defund makes sense on its merits, and I haven't really thought so for a long time. And okay, I'll pause for the people who are going to close the stream now because they just realized what a terrible counter-revolutionary I am to do that, and now I can talk to whoever's still here. I bought into the defund stuff for a minute in 2020, but then that summer, I read a really good article about it by Dino Guastella in Damage that started to make me think a lot harder about the issue. One of the points that Dino made is that, well, big city police departments are sometimes ridiculously well-funded and, cops, make a killing in overtime and all that. Like any other municipal budget item, it varies a lot from city and town to city and town. There's actually a lot of the country, a lot of little towns where cops are paid like Walmart greeters. And it actually seems like saying, oh, that should be cut even from there, right? It actually seems like a really bad idea to have people we empower to use coercive force be financially stressed. And let me just say in passing that this is a point I've thought about a lot since I started to live on and off on the other side of the border in the last few years in Mexico, where cops are paid dirt and not coincidentally police corruption is out of control. And, I can tell you some stories about being pulled over in Mexico. And things have been like that for a very long time. I certainly don't blame the current government for that, but it is the reality. But just in general, the idea that we'll get better city services by tightening budgets really stinks of libertarianism to me. I know some people will bring up the comparison to cutting the military to reallocate to domestic social spending, but I just don't think that's a good analogy. Our imperial globe-striding military force just isn't providing a necessary public service in the same way that, in any society, right? Capitalist, socialist, whatever, right? We do, we are going to have some laws. Are going to have to empower somebody to enforce them. And I want there to be something to do about interpersonal violence besides like retaliatory, individual violence. And it's not, don't get me wrong, it's not like I think police budgets are set by God and they should never be cut. Sometimes they should be cut. But I also think there are a lot of situations where, the necessary service that is provided by having some kind of professional law enforcement, which, again, even if you think we're going to have a dramatic revolutionary rupture where we smash the state, whatever. I mean, after that, still need a police force, and judging by every revolutionary rupture that's ever happened anywhere in the world, you're even going to get a lot of overlap in personnel before and after, because that always happens. But sometimes that necessary service actually needs more funding to be done justly and well. Oftentimes, to have a reasonable discussion about all this, I actually think it's useful to break it down. So we're not just talking about money to police, right? The overall size of that budget line. We're asking what specifically the money is for. To pick the American city I've spent the most time in the last few years, I don't think the LAPD necessarily needs so many helicopters that Los Angeles damn near has its own Air Force, which is the situation right now. But I would be all in favor of spending more money on training cops in peaceful de-escalation techniques. Something I remember hearing a lot in the summer of 2020 was that more training won't help. Right? And people who said that, more training won't help with this, always sounded so fucking confident, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, but I never understood why they were convinced that it wouldn't help. Actually, if you start looking at global comparisons about required hours of training, American cops are given firearms and allowed to start patrolling our streets after bizarrely little training by global standards. And I don't think it's a coincidence. We have so much more police violence here than in countries that do a lot more training. Meanwhile, we still have horrendously high rates of crime and violence compared to the rest of the developed world. So we've got the worst of both worlds going. Ultimately, I think there's a future where we could have the best of both worlds, where we can have our cake and eat it too, in terms of both having safer streets and a more liberal and humane criminal justice system. My go-to way of making this point, if you've watched the show in the last few years, you've probably heard me say this, is always to talk about Norway. They have an almost unfathomably nicer criminal justice system than we do. They don't have the death penalty. They don't have life in prison without the possibility of parole. Their prison cells look like pretty nice dorm rooms. And even murderers and rapists usually get out eventually. Right? You like nobody is like denied the hearing to see if you're ready to get out. And nonetheless, they have a lot less murder and rape than we do. And it's definitely not like innate in their culture or genetics that they're less violent than us. I mean, if you know literally anything about their history before the 20th century, you know that's not it, right? It's that their strong unions and socialist political parties achieved a better social contract for the working class in the 20th century. Even if they haven't made it all the way to anything like the kind of full socialism that I would advocate as a long-term horizon. And even after all the neoliberal chipping away in the last few decades, they still have, in many respects, a much more equal and less materially precarious society than ours is. That's how you can have your cake and eat it too on public safety and criminal justice. But more and more in the last few years, I've worried that the left is often getting the order of operations wrong here. We might need to start by creating a more economically equal society, so there'll be less crime and more space for public buy-in for liberalizing the criminal justice system, making it more humane and reasonable. And the problem is that we've often been trying to do it the other way around, for the simple reason that it's a hell of a lot easier for the left to win a DA election in a liberal city than it is to seize the levers of national power and implement sweeping social democratic reforms. Never mind going further than that and start to really socialize the economy. So we keep trying to do it the other way around, and we keep running into massive political backlash. I think Zohran's instinct on this is really smart. He's not ignoring criminal justice reform. He does want to experiment with an unarmed safety force that could handle certain kinds of low-level calls, at least as a first line of response, and free up the real cops to handle real serious violent crime. But he's also not going to push too hard on it at this stage and risk all of his political capital on fighting about that, instead of the kind of affordability wins that could actually change the fortunes of the socialist left all over the country for the better. Probably the most unhinged criticism I've seen is that Zohran is a fascist collaborator. The World Socialist website, for example, did an article saying that. Part of the article was actually devoted to trashing me, which is always an honor. I was also happy that Jonathan Chait spent part of his Atlantic article attacking Graham Plattner, trashing me, same principle. But this World Socialist website article, their reasoning seemed to be: premise one, Trump is a fascist. Premise two, Zohran was like pleasant and smiled and shook his hand and, treated as a normal meeting when he met with him. Therefore, conclusion, he's a total Quisling sellout to fascism, and these Jacobin guys like Burgess who defend him are Quislings too, right? They compared the meeting, I swear I'm not making this up, to the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939. I don't know which Eastern European countries New York City is going to invade as part of the Trump Mamdani plan, but this is the comparison they raised. And guys, just get a grip. Look, I realize the World Socialist website is never going to get a grip, and on some level, I'm picking them as an example here because, well, for example, I also saw a former guest of the show who I like a lot saying almost the same thing that they did. And I don't want to use them as my example because that would make me sad. So I'll stick to using the trots to illustrate this point. But I don't want to focus just on them. As far as I could tell, they're just incoherent. Right? I'm pretty sure they thought that anyone who supported lesser evil voting in swing states last year was a bourgeois sellout crossing the class line, but somehow this year Trump is Hitler. If he's Hitler, how are you guys not willing to vote for centrist liberals to literally stop Hitler? It's very confusing. But let's put the World Socialist website to one side here and focus on anyone who might be smarter than them, who nonetheless converged with them in disliking the Trump meeting. And again, what really frustrates me about this is the total refusal on a lot of quarters to think strategically about this. Like, I'm not, when I say refusal to think strategically, I'm not saying failure to come to the same conclusions that I would about the strategy question, right? It's not that they have different opinions than me about the strategic calculations. That's fine. That's normal. We can hash it out. It's that there are so many people on the online left who just blatantly refuse to even talk or think in those terms at all. They think like the only argument that you need for primarying Jeffries is reciting all the terrible, morally objectionable things about Jeffries' politics. And I agree with the whole list. Yep. Agreed on all points. But then I want to have the strategic argument about whether this particular fight at this particular time would pay off, what the costs and benefits are. And that's a discussion that only starts after we all agree on the premise that Jeffries is awful. Or they just think listing off all the ways that Tisch sucks and is terrible and disgusting settles the argument about whether Zohran should pick a giant fight over policing issues that's going to derail his whole agenda and that he'll lose by firing her right out the gate. And yeah, like they list off all the ways she sucks. And I'm like, yep, agree. But then when it's all over, I want to have the strategic argument. And the same thing with the meeting with Trump. Last year, like 14 months ago, right? October 2024, just before the election, I co-wrote a Jacobin article with Deep State Cuba from TIR, talking about all the reasons to think second round Trump would be more dangerous and authoritarian than first round Trump. And sadly, we were proven way more right than I even thought we would be. I've been writing things all year, like January to present, right? I've been writing nonstop articles, doing what I can to help, raise the alarm about civil liberties and troops in cities and ICE barbarism and birthright citizenship and the rest. No one needs to convince me that Trump is dangerous and authoritarian. Of course he is. But once we've said all that, we can have a strategic conversation about what socialist politicians like Zohran should do to navigate the reality of the Trump presidency. That discussion proceeds on the basis of already knowing all that. Like, yeah, that's the problem. Now the question is what we do about it, how we respond to it. And look, I could happily concede in advance that there are times when the immorality of doing something is so great that no strategic calculation could ever override it. Right? I'm of course, I'm not some dead-eyed utilitarian looking to push people onto trolley tracks for the greater good. But if you see uncrossable moral lines everywhere you look, you're doing left politics wrong. And you just aren't nearly as focused as you should be on actually winning and carrying out a socialist program. In any case, the great point of moral principle for the Trump meeting is supposed to be what? That if Trump is bad and dangerous and authoritarian, which he is, you shouldn't legitimize him by having a meeting with him where you smile and act pleasant, and if there's something that where you think you can get money for New York or whatever, you try to do it. If so, I have to say it's a complete mystery to me how the socialist mayor-elect, who both centrist Democrats, Trumpian Republicans, the whole mainstream media spent a year smearing as an anti-Semite and a Hamas supporter, is supposed to have the power to legitimize the guy who won the national popular vote in last year's presidential election. I mean, that surely should be the other way around. And tactically, that meeting made a whole lot of sense to me. For one thing, everybody spent months expecting that Trump would be sending troops to New York when Zohran came in. He was certainly threatening to do that. He was threatening federal funds to the city, all of that. If Zohran could buy a little time for the city while he pursues his agenda and actually gets some material wins on the board, that's absolutely worth it. And the fact that he did it without conceding or backing down on a single political point, and even called Gaza a genocide to Trump's face, is nothing short of remarkable. If he promised Trump during the closed door part that he'd cut some regulatory red tape for the construction of the next couple of Trump towers in New York, I am absolutely 100% willing to pay that price, and so should you be. And I guess that gets us to the YIMBY thing, but before we do that, one more point about the Trump meeting. Given that Trump does have deeply authoritarian instincts, and he does have a whole chorus of the worst reactionary ghouls you can imagine in his ear, I think the chances that he's going to come into open conflict with Mayor Mamdani at some point in the next couple of years hover right around 100%. Delaying that is a good thing, but sooner or later it's going to happen. But it makes all the sense in the world to rhetorically position himself for that confrontation when it comes by Zohran showing that he started out trying to be the reasonable one. Especially when it comes to keeping the 60,000 or so New Yorkers who voted for Trump in 2024 and Mamdani in 2025 on his side, and then drawing in even more former Trump supporters to his side of the inevitable confrontation. From the beginning of his campaign, Zohran was always interested in thinking about how to appeal to Trump voters. And it's one of the many things I love about him. Because any version of the left that has a chance of defeating Trumpism and going forward. So, we don't get J.D. Vance or someone becoming president in a few years, or in a few years after that when the cycle repeats, is absolutely going to have to win a lot of working class people who went for Trump in 2024 back to the left. And if you don't get that, right? If you don't understand that we need to be thinking about how to appeal to working class Trump voters and then, get them to reject Trump and come back to the left, then no matter how much you might bloviate about fascism, I really don't think you're serious about beating back the kind of authoritarianism that Trump really does represent. Okay, so let's talk about the YIMBY thing. This one might make the least sense of all to me, at least out of the ones we've talked about so far. Zohran ran on freezing rent for rent-stabilized apartments. That's going to be a fight. If he gets to the point where he could start doing more ambitious things like opening up new municipally owned public housing available to people at all income levels on the Sweden model or the Vienna model, the politics of all that are going to be a hell of a lot easier if he's not standing in the way of building more market rate housing also. And honestly, as much as in the long term, I'm actually an abolitionist about capitalist housing markets. I mean, literally, I co-wrote a book called The Blueprint, How Socialism Can Work in the Real World with Bhaskar Sankara and Mike Beggs. And in our model in that book, housing is leased to individuals and families, sometimes even like lifetime leases, the next generation could have their first crack at it or whatever. But it's ultimately all built and owned by a public housing authority, right? That's my long-term preference. But as long as we don't have that world yet, I actually think easing bottlenecks of housing supply is often the lesser evil in the here and now. So, Zohran having some YIMBY real estate guys in his transition team just doesn't make me lose sleep. Sorry. And then the Palestine stuff just depresses me. This is the last time I'm going to mention her in this episode, I promise. But I saw Brianna Joy Gray say that she was disappointed that Zohran had been so good on Palestine during the primary. And then she said he was softening his position in the general election and, backing away from it. And it drove me a little crazy seeing that because Brianna is so good at sounding reasonable, right? That's her superpower. But her premise is just flatly factually untrue. The example she gave was Zohran saying during the general election phase that he discouraged the use of the phrase globalize the intifada. And she presented that as a reversal of his old position, but that's just not true. It's the other thing besides true, false. But seriously, look it up. And this is one of those weird places where Zohran, criticisms of Zohran by Zionists on the one hand and ultra-leftists on the other hand actually weirdly converge. There's like a weird local horseshoe here, like Zionists and ultra-leftists actually live in the same alternate reality on this, where in that alternate reality, Zohran used to go around shouting globalize the intifada, and then he backed away from it under pressure, which Zionists think is Zohran hiding his power levels and ultra-leftists think is him selling out. But in both cases, the premise just isn't true. Zohran never once used the phrase globalize the intifada. He certainly never shouted or chanted it. I mean, that's just not reality. He never even endorsed the slogan. The first time he was asked about it, the first thing he said, first time he was asked about it, the first thing he said was that he personally wouldn't use it because it could be so easily misunderstood, but he wouldn't condemn its use by others because he knew what they were trying to say, even if that's not how he would say it. Look it up. That was his answer the first time. Then later he was asked again, and he said basically a longer and more elaborate version of the same thing, that he understood what people were trying to get at when they used it, but this time he said he would discourage its use. That's still not condemning anybody. That's discouraging a word choice because it could be so easily misinterpreted as a call for violence in Western countries rather than just a metaphorical uprising against support for Israeli apartheid. Honestly, there isn't, you couldn't slip a piece of paper between the substance of those two answers. But Zionists and ultra-leftists both treated that as a huge reversal, which is just asinine. Similarly, when the 2-year anniversary of October 7th came around, Zohran issued a statement where he said exactly what he'd said all election long, which is that the attacks on Israeli civilians on October 7th were a war crime, but that this didn't justify the much bigger war crimes and in fact, genocide that Israel had used October 7th as a pretext to commit. And again, no one who treated this as a big reversal bothered to look up his statement on the 1-year anniversary of October 7th, which was basically a shorter version of exactly the same sentiment, right? Clearly condemning the attacks on civilians on October 7th, but, emphasizing, putting most of the emphasis on the subsequent horrors that Israel carried out in Gaza and opposing that, which are all totally correct sentiments, by the way. Attacking civilians is always wrong, and saying, well, actually, maybe it's okay if they're civilians whose government is really, really bad and, commits apartheid and genocide, really doesn't make you a super edgy anti-Zionist, hardcore warrior. It just makes you ludicrously inconsistent about the most obvious morally principle imaginable, which is it's always wrong to kill civilians. That what Hamas doesn't justify killing Gazan civilians. What the Israeli government doesn't justify killing Israeli civilians. So being inconsistent about that is dumb anyway. And frankly, it makes you a bit of a wrecker, since people who say that, Israeli civilians are all settlers, so they're all fair game or whatever, make it way easier for Zionists to smear and discredit the whole movement. In fact, one of my favorite things about Zohran is that he's been so good and so eloquent in his steadfast, principled anti-Zionism. I absolutely love his answer to the "Does Israel have a right to exist?" question at the debates, which was always to say two things. First, when the question was asked that way, he'd say, yeah, sure, Israel has a right to exist. Because what people are trying to insinuate when they ask it that way is that the issue is whether Israel should be like invaded or wiped out by some conquering foreign power. That's the image that question, does Israel have a right to exist, is intended to evoke. And obviously we don't advocate that. But then when he gets the inevitable follow-up question, does Israel have a right to exist as a Jewish state? He says, no, absolutely not. It has a right to exist as a state of equal rights, but as an American, as a person, he can't accept that any state anywhere, whether Israel or Saudi Arabia, has a right to have a hierarchy based on ethnicity or religion, to be a state for some ethnic or religious subset of its citizens rather than a state for all of them. And that's an absolutely perfect answer. Nevertheless, you'll find people on the online left who insist that Zohran isn't really an anti-Zionist. He's really just a liberal Zionist, which is their term for any leftist who disagrees with them in any way on any issue related to Israel-Palestine, doesn't seem hardcore and pure enough on any of it, right? That they just sort of label all those people liberal Zionists, even if they support a one-state solution with right of return and et cetera. It's the silliest fucking thing ever. But people like this say that Zohran isn't really an anti-Zionist because he said in an interview that there would obviously be Zionists in his administration, right? Like, he's not going to have anti-Zionist loyalty oaths for sanitation jobs. He's not going to fire or not hire otherwise competent and desirable people for municipal jobs that have less than nothing to do with foreign policy because they disagree with him about Palestine. Saying that this is some sort of betrayal is so insane that I'm not even sure what to say about it. But guys, do not be this kind of leftist. Right? You aren't doing Palestinians or anyone else any good whatsoever by being this kind of leftist. You're just going to put us all in this endless death spiral of recriminations and purity testing until you've whittled the left down to the 2 or 3 purist martyrs who can die happy, knowing that they were capital R, capital A, capital E, right about everything. Congratulations. Zohran Mamdani, this immensely talented natural politician who actually comes out of DSA world, Jacobin world, post-Bernie millennial left, who has a well-thought-out, class-first strategic perspective about winning a broad governing majority for the socialist left by relentlessly focusing on economics and affordability, who has the best way of explaining anti-Zionism I've ever heard from an American politician. That guy is about to become the chief executive of the biggest and most important city in the United States in a few weeks. If left media is going to serve any kind of useful function at all right now, a huge part of our mission statement should be to rally support behind him and debunk smears of him and do whatever we can to, media is not politics. Media is at best a useful adjunct to politics, but do whatever we can to promote his agenda going forward. This is one of the greatest moments of political possibility for us that we've had for a very long time. And if you don't get that the future of our movement is at stake here, you've lost the plot. And Democratic Party entryism doesn't work or whatever. It's like people who say this are always promoting strategies that have way worse track records than that. Ignore them. They're not serious people, right? But again, if you are going to be even slightly serious about strategy and power here, if you actually want the left to win and accomplish things, this is a massive moment of political possibility. And sadly, it seems to be that a fair amount of left media, or what used to be called the net roots of the left, right, sort of grassroots online left, does seem to have lost the plot, which is why I've been so frustrated by all this during those long weeks of being off air that I had to get all the stuff off my chest with a long episode this morning. I should say, by the way, that the reason I've been off air for so long is that first, after the last episode we did, I was getting ready for a big trip. And then I was on that trip for a couple of weeks. I went to New York for our election night live show, and then London for the historical materialism conference, and then to do a book launch for my pamphlet, Confessions of a Class Reductionist, with Alfie Brown at King's College London. And then I went to visit my sister and her family. And before I got home to the West Coast, I was planning to do a few days visiting one of my best friends from grad school and his family in Buffalo. But I actually ended up cutting the trip short a few days because my dog Lucy has been having a lot of severe veterinary problems lately, and I was so worried about what I was hearing about her that I actually cut the short trip. Cut the trip short, and I've spent a lot of the last month being convinced that these were the last weeks of Lucy, which was incredibly depressing. I'll spare you the gross medical details, but I've basically been caring for her like she was a baby or a geriatric human getting, home care. And, anyone who knows me in real life knows I'm a pretty obsessive dog owner. Hell, if you've ever been to a GTA live event in LA that was held in an outdoor space, you've probably met Lucy. She's usually running around somewhere at the event saying hi to everyone. I remember when I got divorced a few years ago, I told several people that if my ex hadn't been willing to give me dog custody, that would have been like the one thing I would have actually gone to court over. And I sort of said it like I was joking, but I also kind of meant it. That dog has been such a massive part of my life the last 11 years. Seeing her like this has been really awful, and I've been trying to do everything I can, all of which has meant that everything else has been on ice since I got back. I haven't been doing the usual capital classes on Patreon that I do on the weekends, right? The volume 1 class on Saturday, the volume 2 class on Sunday, or the in-person capital volume 1 class that I've been doing in LA. I haven't been doing the show, obviously. I've still been writing a lot of articles because what the hell else am I supposed to do while I'm sitting on the couch all day taking care of my immobile dog? There's only so much TV you can watch, but writing is pretty much the only thing I've been doing. The good news, though, is that starting a little before Thanksgiving, she actually did start to get a little bit better. The basics haven't changed. And I don't know how things are going to look in a month, but she can at least prop herself up on her front legs. And she does seem to be a little perkier and a little bit more like her old self. So I'm actually cautiously optimistic that she'll be around for a little while longer. And I'm starting to ease back into regularly scheduled activities. I didn't get it together to teach the Patreon capital classes last weekend, but I did teach the in-person capital class in LA, which I'm planning to do again this week, by the way. That's 7 p.m. at Cafe Mach in Koreatown on Wednesday for anyone who wants to join. We're going to be talking about Chapter 21 and peace wages on Wednesday. And come hell or high water, I am going to go back to the 2 Patreon capital classes this weekend. We've been off for a ridiculously long time. We need to get back on. And started today. I'm back and on the horse for podcasting. I'm not going to try to do every weekend like I was doing for a little while, every weekday. So I'm not going to try to do every weekday like I was doing for a little while earlier, though, at least not at first. Like I said, easing back in. So no show tomorrow, but we will be back on Wednesday. With an episode about the new translation of Capital. And on Friday, I think we're going to do the episode on everyone's favorite Nazi, Nick Fuentes. So as they say in The Wire, we're back up. And on that note, I will see everybody on Wednesday. Left is best.